African Americans had been excluded from colonial militias, that is, the armies of the different colonies, largely out of fear of placing arms in their hands, lest, as a group of colonists from Carolina warned, our slaves, when armed, might become our masters. Fear of slave rebellions and joint insurrections of Native Americans and African Americans caused Virginia in 1656 and Connecticut in 1660 to exclude African Americans from their militia. Also, fear that free blacks might inspire slave revolts caused colonists to assign them to non-combat services. In several colonies, free blacks were required, instead of bearing arms, to work on the roads and highways. Refusal to perform this work led to fines and imprisonment. But this widespread colonial policy of excluding African Americans from the militia broke down in time of war. The scarcity of manpower led to the acceptance of black recruits, both slave and free. With the prospect of gaining freedom, slaves joined colonial forces, and free blacks, hoping to achieve greater civil rights, also enlisted. By the time of the American Revolution, black veterans of colonial wars made up an experienced core of the colonial forces. So it isn't surprising that there were black Minutemen, that is, African Americans, there at Lexington and Concord during the first shots of the American Revolution. Men like Peter Salem and Samuel Kraft and Cato Wood were among those who responded to Paul Revere's warning on April 19, 1775. While many African Americans, slave and free, continued to look forward to service as a way of achieving freedom and expanded civil rights, white revolutionary leaders began to have second thoughts about using them in the armed forces. First, many feared that slaves who were armed as part of the colonial forces might join forces with their fellow slaves in uprisings. When the Massachusetts militia marched to Lexington in 1775, the slaves were rumored to be mobilizing to massacre those left behind. The residents of Framingham, Massachusetts, took these reports so seriously that they armed themselves with axes, clubs, and pitchforks and locked themselves inside their homes until the militia returned. On May 29, 1775, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety banned the enlistment of slaves in the armies of this colony. This action foreshadowed the national policy adopted in regard to African American soldiers. When the Continental Congress took over the army around Boston in June, under the command of George Washington, it soon forbid the enrollment of African Americans. This order did not dismiss those blacks already in the army, but an attempt to do just that was soon made in the Continental Congress with the strong support of Southern delegates. While this particular motion was defeated, most were determined that once these African American soldiers who had already enlisted, once their enlistments expired, that the army would be all white. It was the British who forced a reversal of this policy. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, Royal Governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation promising freedom to any white indentured servant or black slave who joined the British. Rumors spread throughout Virginia that slaves were flocking to join the British. In New York, an African American mother was said to have named her son after the lordship. In Philadelphia, a black man was rumored to have jostled whites on the street and told them, "Wait until Lord Dunmore and his black regiment come, and then we will see who is to take the wall." The blacks who did reach the British, probably only about 800 or so, performed many duties. Most immediately saw military action in both Army and naval services. Another service performed by these African American recruits was foraging. Supplies, particularly fresh foods, needed constant replenishment, and of course, the British couldn't send in men to make these purchases. Raiding parties made up of mostly ex-slaves went into the countryside and often came away with livestock and other foodstuff. Despite these small numbers, it's clear the colonial leaders feared the effects of this proclamation. A month after the proclamation, George Washington wrote, "If that man Dunmore is not crushed before spring, he will become the most dangerous man in America. His strength will increase like a snowball rolling downhill. Success will depend on which side can arm the Negroes the faster." Uncommitted Southern planters, unsure about their full support and participation of the American Revolution and independence, were both angered and fearful of Dunmore's proclamation. Maryland planters foresaw united action by poor whites and African American slaves, aided by the British, to seize the best land and divide it among themselves. Virginia slave owners shared this view, and in its convention's call for independence, denounced Dunmore. In a sense, many saw that to crush a potential slave rebellion of major proportions, they had to rebel against the mother country, England. That is, to prevent a slave revolt. Many who weren't initially sure that independence from England was a good idea came to believe that it was a necessity. On July 16, 1776, 2 months after the British proclamation, the Continental Congress agreed to the re-enlistment of free blacks, and soon afterwards, due to the problem of raising sufficient troops to wage the war, the Continental Congress would soon enlist slaves as well. As you can probably tell, the reasons for African American involvement in the war and the reasons white colonists increasingly but grudgingly saw the need for black involvement were something at cross purposes. African Americans, slave and free, often used the war to secure freedom and rights that otherwise would have been withheld. Generally, African American soldiers were privates in the Army, assigned as if by nature to this rank. Even more than other privates in the Army, they tended to lack identities, or at least lack identities that historians can trace in large numbers and in any great detail. Black soldiers were often carried on the rolls of the Army as a Negro man or a Negro, name not known. Such records might reflect both the degree to which white colonists didn't view African Americans, even those defending them, as individuals, but it also might reflect the desire of black soldiers, especially those who were runaway slaves, to remain anonymous. While a small number of African Americans saw service in the cavalry and artillery regiments, the vast majority served with the infantry. Often these soldiers were non-arms bearing and giving duties as orderlies or assigned duties in support of combat operation. Other than these duties, African American soldiers were often assigned such domestic duties as waiters and cooks. Lastly, African Americans were usually assigned to foraging services. While these were the official duties of black soldiers, it's clear that blacks were involved in combat and suffered many losses. In the course of battles, duties were often shifted and arms handed over to black recruits. One historian has estimated that this war for freedom extended civil rights to about 15% of the population, leaving the poor colonists, the slaves, all women, and Native Americans pretty much at the mercies of the few. The Revolutionary War was full of contradictions for African Americans in particular. The clearest contradiction involved slavery and the ideology the Founding Fathers used to justify breaking with England. A third of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, the document declaring the right to independent nationhood, on the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, a third of these men owned other humans. In addition, the nation that was created was one in which slavery was a foundation of the society, in which 500,000 African American slaves lived, and in which the wealthiest Southerners would not even consider joining without a clear recognition of their right to own slaves. But the contradictions involve more than slavery and revolutionary ideology. Among the results of the revolution were somewhat paradoxical changes in African American society and culture. The revolution made it possible for some African Americans to gain their freedom. It led to the ending of slavery in the states north of Maryland and a good deal of manumission, that is, freeing of slaves, in the upper South. It also gave even more African Americans the idea that freedom was not just a hope or goal to be obtained, but a right to expect. Now, if we take a look at the writing of the Declaration of Independence, the first draft, as prepared by Thomas Jefferson, contained an indictment of the slave trade. George III, King of England, he wrote, has waged a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere only to incur miserable death in their transportation there. There was no real mention of the institution of slavery itself being evil. In fact, Jefferson himself owned slaves and firmly believed that Africans were inferior and suspected that regardless of their condition, slave or free, they would remain so. This passage that I just read did not remain in the final draft of the Declaration. Southern delegates at the Continental Congress objected to it, and even some Northerners did as well, because they felt that their role in the slave trade as carriers of slaves within the colonies did not make them immune from this criticism, nor were they particularly eager to give up this lucrative business in the slave trade. So this draft section, is stricken from the Declaration. What did remain was the accusation that King George III had, quote, excited domestic insurrections against us. And this is probably a reference to Lord Dunmore's proclamation and the suspicion that this proclamation was issued to incite slave rebellion. While a growing number of anti-slavery proponents and most African Americans saw the language of the Declaration, things like unalienable rights and all men are created equal, they saw these things as applying to all. Of course, most signers of the Declaration didn't see it this way. It's clear that slavery was linked to revolutionary ideology. The rhetoric of the revolution was often the language that directly brought up imagery of slaves throwing off the tyranny of their masters. It's also clear that the question of African American slavery never became a central issue of the American Revolution for white colonists, and many refused to see the connection between their assertion of their natural rights to life and liberty. They never saw a connection between that and the actual enslavement of black people. John Adams noted that Americans had lived many years with the practice and that, quote, the best men in my vicinity thought it not inconsistent with their character. And it was, of course, these best men who made the decisions that counted. Some did see the inconsistency between the rhetoric of the revolution and its practice, but above all desired unity among the colonies. Because if it took the proclamation of Lord Dunmore to get the South to fully support the war, making the Revolution an anti-slavery crusade, probably would have driven these Southerners back to the British. Slavery as an institution was, in many ways, much more influential than the philosophy of the Revolution. When Patrick Henry, the man made famous for saying the words, "Give me liberty or give me death," received a copy of an anti-slavery pamphlet, he replied that he looked forward to the day when the lamentable evil, as he put it, would be abolished, but meanwhile he would continue to hold slaves because of, quote, the general inconvenience of living without them. Well, if the intent of the Declaration and the Founding Fathers wasn't to abolish slavery, the words certainly held out the hope and appeared to declare freedom as a right for all, at least all men, that is. Even before the Declaration, it's fairly clear that increasing tensions between Great Britain and America created the context for black slaves to take greater initiative in obtaining their freedom. There were slave revolts in South Carolina in 1765 and 1768. There were revolts in Georgia in 1771 and 1772. The month before Minutemen faced the British at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, slaves in Ulster County, New York, organized an uprising that also involved 500 Native Americans. By the summer of 1775, patriots found armed slaves a threat from Maryland to Georgia. Hundreds of slaves struck in 3 North Carolina counties, but were eventually defeated. In this context, we see Lord Dunmore's proclamation somewhat differently. It certainly was an attempt to enlist the aid of black slaves against the colonists, but it probably was also an effort to encourage more slave insurrections, just as the colonists suspected. Slaves fled in the thousands during the Revolution. Now, only a few of those, relatively small number of those slaves, reached the British. But it's clear that many, many more slaves were taking advantage of the war to establish their own freedom. Even colonial leaders like James Madison and George Washington lost slaves during the war. Some slaves even established separate communities in the colonies. These maroon communities often carried out guerrilla warfare against the colonists themselves. One such group named themselves the King of England and lived along the Savannah River until they were eventually defeated in May of 1786, 3 years after the war ends. In Massachusetts, 6 months after the Declaration was signed, a petition of, quote, a great number of Negroes who are detained in a state of slavery in the bowels of a free and Christian country asserted their, quote, natural and unalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe hath bestowed equally on mankind. Reading from this petition, following the laudable example of the good people of these states, your petitioners have long and patiently waited the event of petition after petition. They cannot but express their astonishment that it has not been considered that every principle from which America has acted in the course of her unhappy difficulties with Great Britain pleads stronger than 1,000 arguments, that they may be restored to the enjoyment of that freedom which is the natural right of all men. 8 African American men, mostly freemen, signed this petition. In Connecticut, during the spring of 1770, another petition is issued, and asking that the colony's General Assembly basically consider the abolishment of the institution of slavery. We see petitions in New Hampshire and other northern states. The direct results of these petitions was usually not abolition, but they did reflect a growing sentiment among blacks and a growing number of whites in the North that freedom was a right being denied African Americans. The Revolutionary era saw the growth of moral opposition to slavery in the northern colonies. Anti-slavery forces had been active on the local level in New England since the 1750s. Efforts paid off by the late 1770s when northern states began writing constitutions that contained humanitarian ideas. Vermont was the first to really spell these ideas out, making it illegal to hold a male person as a slave after the age of 21 and a woman after the age of 18. Meanwhile, dozens of test cases pecked away at the constitutionality of slavery in Massachusetts. As they did, slaves began leaving their owners, feeling certain that the courts would not support their return. By 1783, the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that the clause of the state's 1780 Constitution, declaring, quote, all men are born free and equal, applied to all. Slavery in that state was on its last legs. Elsewhere in the North, abolition moved more slowly. Policies of gradual abolition ensured the revolutionary generation its labor supply and enabled whites to keep African American slaves until they can replace them with inexpensive white workers. The Pennsylvania General Assembly passed a gradual abolition law in 1780. Connecticut and Rhode Island did the same in 1784. New York and New Jersey were slow to follow the example of these other northern states. Each passed its own gradual abolition bill, New York in 1799 and New Jersey in 1804. So slavery lingered for several decades. New York remained the last northern holder of slaves, with nearly 20,000 in 1800. These numbers declined through the next 2 decades, however, and for all practical purposes, slavery ceased to exist in the northern states by the end of the first quarter of the 19th century. Now, this shouldn't give you the idea that abolition was smooth and easy in the North. Northern owners knew the value of their property in slaves, and they fought abolition strongly. But economic conditions in the North helped abolitionist attitudes spread. Basic to the spread of these anti-slavery attitudes was the fact that the Northern economy didn't have to have slavery, especially with the increasing number of inexpensive white laborers entering the country. Those who didn't own slaves feared the advantages of those who did. Also, white workers resented having to compete with slave labor. So both these groups, non-slave owners and white workers, soon favored abolition. So it turned out to be easier to apply the humanitarian ideology of the revolution to all people in those places where universal freedom didn't affect the economy, and in some ways seemed to help the economy. So, in many ways, slavery is the symbol of the revolutionary era of American history. While white colonists fought to resist what they saw as their own political enslavement, they clung, especially in the South, even tighter to the institution that seemed to be the foundation of their independence. For African Americans, the rhetoric of freedom and equality provided the context to push their growing sense of entitlement, their right to be free. Of course, given the nature of the Northern economy, this right was easier, though not easy, to eventually take than it was in the South. Still, Black resistance to enslavement, both violent and nonviolent, demonstrate this series of political and social rebellions that made up the internal and external American revolutions.